such a pleasure to have Tim Muehlhoff in my show in God-Sized Stories. He is a professor of communications at Biola University, and he is the co-director of Biola's Winsome Conviction Project and co-host of Winsome Conviction Podcast. And he is the author, together with Sean McDowell, of this new book, and the stalemate, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Well, I was reading about your book and just browsing it, and I just had this thought in my mind, with everything that has just happened, the past week, with President Biden stepping down and Kamala Harris, the presumptive nominee now for the Democratic Party, and all the craziness that we already know that's going on in the media. And I thought, well, this is a timely conversation for sure, because I know that your idea in this book is to address all this polarized views that our culture has, right? But tell us how this book came about. What made you and Sean interested in putting this together?
Well, I think we share the same frustration most Americans do. 98% of Americans, think about that. In a time we don't agree on anything, 98% of us would say incivility is a threat to this country. And 67% would say we've reached crisis levels of incivility. So we, like most people, rightly think we can't continue going down this road. And so we've got to reshuffle the deck and do something different. And so that's why we came up with this idea of let's end a stalemate. And again, this book is for families, marriages, communities, neighborhoods, that when you feel like you're just at a standstill when it comes to an argument or a disagreement, what are some different ways we can think about opening communication, not closing it?
Yes, such an important subject. And you point out in your book right away that we have become, which is very true, a very polarized country. And why do you think, what are the reasons behind this polarity?
Well, I think Americans have always fundamentally disagreed. That's why we have two political parties. That's why we have different universities. Mine is a religious university, and there's secular universities. But we had on our podcast Arthur Brooks. He's a Harvard researcher. And he said, I thought this was fascinating. He said, America doesn't have an anger problem. We have a contempt problem. Said, okay, what's the difference between anger and contempt? And he said, okay, anger is you and I can be mad at each other, but we're family members. We're going to protect the relationship. We're church members. We're part of a community. Contempt is I'm mad at you, and I don't care if you're part of this family anymore. I think the church would be better off without you. I think we'd be stronger if you left the neighborhood. And so I think he's right that contempt is we're cutting off the conversation. And there was a study done based on the 2016 presidential election where 33% of respondents said they no longer talk to a family member because of the 2016 presidential election. That's contempt.
Isn't that crazy? And and I don't know about other cultures, but I will tell you, and I'm coming from a Latin culture, I'm from Brazil originally, and this type of really generalized behavior in a society is very, very typical to Americans. And I'll tell you this because, one of the things that Brazilians, Italians, and Spanish people are very well known for is just they just speak their minds. And it's very common that you're going to have an argument with a family and sometimes family member, and sometimes an angry argument about something, but you solve the issue, you come to a common ground, and you move on. And it seems like to me in America there is this like diplomatic nuance about it, about the culture where people, of course, it's great to argue in a nice and civilized way. We want to do that, but you can get to a place where you avoid so much the arguments that you do not solve any problems. Do you not agree that this is exactly where we are as a nation?
So there's a form of conflict called latent conflict. That's what rests below the surface. So you and I can be mad at each other, but we're going to be cordial. We see each other in church. We see each other at soccer practice with our kids. We're going to smile. We're not going to say mean things. We're not going to be rude. But in the book, we address this concept called emotional contagion, which is those negative emotions bleed out into the conversation and you pick up on it. To put it in popular language, you get a bad vibe from me as opposed to a good vibe. So we actually poison the conversation before it starts. That's why in our book, we really talk about addressing the heart. The Bible mentions the heart 500 times.
Mm.
And Jesus goes so far as to say, it's from your heart that you speak. So a big part of the book is let's learn how to address anger, resentment, bitterness, sarcasm at the heart level before we actually have this conversation. Because if we don't, it's really going to poison the relationship and the conversation before it even starts.
Mm. I love that. It is so true. And Jesus, he addressed religion as really a heart religion before anything. That's why he came to kind of reframe our thinking concerning everything, every behavior. Like to go back to your heart. What are your feelings? What do you feel? And I love it that you address that in the book, that you have to address why people are feeling the way that they are. And you talk about violating at the relational level in your book. Can you explain to us what you mean by that?
So communication always exists on two levels, where we tend to think it only exists on one. So for sure, one level is my opinion, my argument, my ideology. That's the content level. I'm going to tell you why I'm going to vote this way. Come November, I'm going to tell you why I think this about certain issues. But the relational level is made up of the amount of respect between you and me, the amount of empathy, and the amount of acknowledging each other's perspective. Like, I don't need to agree with you, but do I acknowledge the weight, the seriousness of your perspective? Now, here's what we know from calm theory. If I violate the relational, I do not care about your content. I don't care. Like, if I picked up in this interview that you didn't respect me, it would change everything, right? Because I'd be
Yes.
like, well, if I'm not respected, I don't care what you think.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're having a crisis today is on the relational level. Listen, Democrats and Republicans have always disagreed,
Right.
uh, but now the relational level is in crisis. The utter lack of respect between President Trump and Kamala Harris publicly. They're not even
Yes.
trying to hide it today. And
Yes.
that's what I think we need to make sure doesn't bleed into our personal relationships. I need to work on my empathy with you. I need to work on my desire to understand what you're saying, not necessarily condone it, but understand it.
But talk to me about this crisis that we are facing from the Christian standpoint. So, of course, we can argue all day long that the society is like that as a whole. What about the church? Like, where are we, and why is that a huge issue, Tim?
Well, I can tell you, we know from research, Pew Research, the perspective of the church is really low. Like people are not looking to the church for answers, not when it comes to this. They tend to think that we use social media just like everybody else attacking each other. But I go back to what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. When asked, who are the true followers of God? Jesus responds, blessed are the peacemakers. They should be called the sons of God. So I think today we need to seek to have peace, not at all costs, but we need to change mostly the relational level. So remember
Mm.
what Peter says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. That's content. But notice what he says, in all gentleness and reverence. That's the relational.
Absolutely. Such an important point because you were talking about the difference, the different point of views politically. And I just remembered a very good friend of mine and we have very different political views. And early in our relationship, we went out for dinner one day, and I told her, so I was not born in this country, so I wasn't raised here. So there are some things that I don't understand. I want to know, why is it that you, as a believer, you side with this party that agrees with a lot of things that are against what the Bible, preaches, abortion, different things. And I told her, I want to understand. And she is an African American friend, and she explained to me, where everything came from all the way in her childhood, and back in the 60s, and different things. And she explained, and you said something that you have to develop that empathy. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree, but when you take that heart of saying, I want to understand where you come from, what is your story, right? What's your story? Why is it that you get to where you are? You are a strong, faithful believer, but yet some things change your political views, or make your political views go a certain way. And that type of conversation, I don't think is very common at all. I think that people avoid it at all costs, right? Why do you think that people avoid it so much?
Well, I think I would say two things. One, they don't have the will to do it. Like, I don't want to empathize with you. I think your perspective is wrong. I totally disagree with your perspective. So I don't want to empathize. But maybe I do want to empathize, but I honestly don't know how to do it. Like, I start out to do it, but you say something and it just trips my wires and I stop empathy. Let me give you, for instance, I was just on Sean's YouTube channel. He has almost 300,000 followers on his YouTube channel. So we decided to work on a disagreement that arose when we were writing the book. Here's the disagreement. I would use preferred pronouns. Depending on the situation. Sean would never use preferred pronouns, right?
Right.
But I would, based on certain situations. We just launched it 5 days ago. It's up to like 20,000 views with over 1,000 comments.
Wow.
A ton of people. It's probably breaking 75, 25, 75 completely disagree with me. Some even calling for that I should be fired from the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, where I teach. Some don't even want to empathize. It's like, dude, you're wrong. Case closed. I'm not going to empathize with the view that I don't understand, I don't agree with, and I think is liberal. Okay, well, guess what? Welcome to the stalemate.
Yes.
If our attitude, nobody's, now I'm not saying I'm right. Sean makes some really good points, but can you develop the skill to set aside your own perspective long enough that you can step back, listen to both of us, and then objectively say, okay, Tim says this, Sean says this, and here's why I come down. That's a lost skill in our culture today. We better start being able to learn how to listen to things we disagree with, objectively find common ground, and then move to points of disagreement.
Oh my goodness. I just think about Jesus. He exemplified that beautifully. And, in the gospel, he,
Right.
he never, he welcomed people who had lifestyles that were wrong. He went and he had dinner with the Pharisees, that, the tax collectors, but he stayed true to who he was. But never, ever, ever in a way that would close the doors for people to listen to his message. And he was very point blank about what he believed in and what is the truth of God's word and God's standpoint of things, but he would welcome everyone in a loving way. And I believe that a lot of Christians, especially the conservative Christians, politically conservative Christians, right? That, which is kind of like weird to say that word, but it is true, right? We have conservative politically Christians and others that are not. And for those, it seems like I see two camps there, and one camp does not want to give a microphone even to
Right.
someone, right?
Right.
who disagrees. And that is, to me, that's unbiblical.
So Alistair Begg is one of our, he's been around 30 years as a Bible teacher, has a radio program podcast. He was asked we had him on our podcast, his co-host, Bob Lapine, he's a friend of mine. Alistair takes questions every once in a while, right? Here was the question presented to him. I'm a grandmother. My granddaughter is transitioning and is getting married. Should I go to the wedding?
Hmm.
Okay, so here's what Alistair Begg said. He said, okay, does your granddaughter know where you stand on the issue? Grandmother, yes. I've clearly explained I don't think this is biblical, right? Alistair Begg, then I would go to the wedding to work on the relational level and love her so that eventually you can speak God's truth. 180 Christian stations canceled Alistair Begg. For 30 years of ministry, they didn't like how he answered one question and got rid of Alistair Begg. So when we write, the subtitle of our book is Move from Cancel Culture to Meaningful Conversations. I get asked the question all the time, well, don't you hate it when liberals cancel? I'm like, yes, but conservatives do it too.
We do.
Yeah, so that's what we're trying to do is open the conversation. So let me recommend one application point for your listeners. So when the book came out, we hired a really talented web designer to have an interactive website that goes along with the book. Now, you don't need to have bought the book. It's totally free. But if your listeners go to endthestalemate.com, we're going to give them exercises to develop that muscle of listening to perspectives you may disagree with. And we're going to take you through it. So I would just encourage people, if they want to, go to endthestalemate.com and they can begin to practice. And it's going to test them.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's going to test them. But that's the spiritual part where I say, God, help me not to be defensive. Help me to listen, empathize. And then you can disagree, but let's first open conversations.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I saw the website and it's very good. And I will put the website on my show notes. So if you're listening, just go to the link on the show notes and you'll see it's really, really good. It will give you just a good perspective and it will kind of challenge you a little bit in how you respond, for sure. It's great. Well, you just go ahead.
My wife was looking at an early version of it, the prototype, and she yelled from a back bedroom, I don't like this website. And I said, I know, I don't either, because it forces you to come across a perspective that you're going to go, nope, I do not agree with this. But we're just asking, not to condone it. We're just asking you to use simple principles to be in a space that I can listen, seek to find common ground, empathize, and then of course you can disagree. Perspectives you're going to come across. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, now let's just be honest about something as far as our culture is concerned with Christianity, right? I have the sense, especially with social media and media in general, where every point of view is accepted and tolerated, but not the Christian worldview.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's just like, let's talk about just, mainstream media and, progressive thinkers. So why do you think the progressive thinkers are increasingly intolerant of Christian view?
Well, I think Jesus himself would say, listen, my message, he said this in the Gospels, will separate families. I mean, it's divisive in today's pluralistic world. And by the way, there's a lot of great things about America being pluralistic. Like, I'm glad to live in a country where we have tolerance for very diverse religious and secular and atheistic views. My wife and I lived in the former Soviet Union for a year. And man, you come out of there really appreciating the fact that we have freedom of speech in this country, right? So I get that people feel like, but Christianity's been taking a lot of hits. I mean, my goodness, the opening ceremonies of the Paris, right? The iconic symbol,
Yes.
right, is the Lord's table.
Hmm.
And it was, I think, just openly mocked. But here's what I would say. We have to be different as Christians. So what does Peter say? In First Peter, he says, when insulted, which we all were watching that, do not insult in return, Peter says, but give a blessing instead. Now, that blessing doesn't mean that we don't speak out against what we saw in that opening sermon.
Right.
It was really cool to see that there were thousands of Christians who just met, I think, yesterday, singing worship songs, praying.
Hmm.
But we respond in a way, remember what Peter said, with graciousness and respect, even to people who disrespect us. We still afford them kindness, empathy. Remember what Paul said, when your enemy's hungry, feed them.
Yes, feed them.
Don't withhold
Exactly.
food. So I think that's
Yes.
what makes us different as Christian communicators.
I think that one of the things that really strikes me with stories like the opening ceremony is people go to social media and they react as if we are not to expect this
Right,
from the current culture,
right.
right? And I mean, it was shocking. I'm against it. I think it is appalling, and we should speak up against it. Yes, but to act as if this is not something expected, you have to read your Bible. I believe that we are, we have been, as a faith, we have been persecuted from the get-go. We were not the only faith persecuted. We know that because we have a long history in the middle, especially in the Middle Ages, of persecuting other faiths. But we will always be seen in this way. We are an exclusive faith. There's one God, there's one way, and the world's going to come against us. So to act surprised, it doesn't make sense to me.
And Jesus said it's going to get worse.
Oh, yes,
He said it's going to
exactly.
get worse. So let me just say this about offending people. So at Biola University is Ed Stetzer, who is the theological advisor for the He Gets Us campaign. The
Oh.
He Gets Us campaign was shown at the Super Bowl. It's being shown in the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just recognize that when we present Jesus as the only way, that is deeply offensive to a lot of people. So I get that we all felt offended and we hated it, what we saw in the opening ceremonies of Paris. Let's just remember, let's not just casually offend other people. So let's have a little bit of empathy for people that are offended by the exclusive message of Jesus, right? Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through Jesus. Well, that's deeply offensive, and we just need to own that and to say, listen, I understand that our message can come across offensive and exclusivistic. It's not that we don't appreciate other world religions, but at the end of the day, we let Jesus be Jesus. So
Yes.
when we experience being offended, let's remember what that feels like, and let's not do that with other people so quickly offend the trans community or LGBTQ community or things like that. Let's be very careful
Yes.
how we couch our beliefs, knowing eventually we're going to offend, but let's not needlessly offend.
The most important thing, let's not close the door, burn the bridges, so that the one intent and the one calling that Jesus gave us, which was to make disciples of all nations, and
Yes,
baptizing them. In other
yes,
words, making new believers. Because of our actions, we're going to make them turn completely away from the cross. So
yes.
that is such an important thing. You have to be truthful to your convictions and with grace. And people who practice that, it's really not that hard. It's just like trying to wear somebody else's shoes, coming from where they come from, understanding their walk, understanding their, even the way they were brought up, their environment, who's feeding what they believe. And if you are full of rage and contempt, uh, you're going to shut the door for that, and you're sending somebody to hell. Whereas they might listen to you if you were gracious and good to them. And I have an example at home, because my daughter, she's a Zumba instructor, and she so we're in the Zumba community. There's a lot of men who are homosexual who are instructors too. And she was at a restaurant having dinner after a gathering with all the friends, and this guy came to her, and she was talking about her beliefs to him, and she said, I believe Jesus is the only way, but I love you, I love you, however I love you. And he looked at her and he started crying, and he said, I have never heard that from a believer, from a Christian.
Oh, wow.
And he started crying, and Adriana turned around and she looked at him and she said, I am sorry that the people that you have met have presented that kind of Jesus to you. He loves you too, and I was so proud of her, just 21 years old, but understanding that she can be strong in her belief and yet, open the conversation with someone.
And that's Paul. Speak truth in
Mm-hmm.
love.
In love.
And I think if we can't do both, then I don't think we do either. Like, I don't think Paul's separating the two. He's saying, by all means, speak the truth of the gospel, but you have to do it in love, or you're violating what Paul's, I think, trying to get at. And I think a lot of us can be harsh with other people. And so that's why we go back to the start of this interview. It's from the heart that you speak. So let's deal with the heart.
Absolutely. Now, Tim, what we're talking about is sympathy, right? It's like, and you have a term in your book that's called sympathetic awareness. Tell us what that is, as you explain in the book, and how can we develop it?
Yeah, so sympathetic awareness, honestly, you could swap that out with empathy in some ways. But sympathetic awareness is, I don't just listen to your perspective. I attempt to feel it, both emotionally and cognitively. So I taught a class on engaging diverse perspectives, and we were studying Skid Row. Skid Row is right about 60 miles away from Biola, one of the largest populations of homeless in the entire country. So I just said to my students, what's it like to be homeless? So we spent a night outside, and it got cold. People think it doesn't get cold. We dipped into the 30s.
Wow.
Students were freezing, and I was freezing, so we called it off at 4. But and again, I'm not saying because we did that, I understand what it's like to be homeless. But sympathetic awareness was, I will never forget shivering, trying to go to sleep on wet grass. And we had a conversation at 4 in the morning. What if that was your daily existence? So sympathetic awareness is saying, I want to try to understand and feel your perspective. And I got just a little bit of a feeling of what it must be like to go to bed shivering. And I think we need to try to do more of that with people we disagree with, to understand it and feel it.
And it's you almost suggested in the book as a deliberate action too, right? Exactly. And in the second part of your book, you offer some practical tips for engaging with others. Can you just share some of them with the public?
Yeah. So John Gottman, one of the top relational scholars in the world, says the first 30 seconds of a conversation sets the tone for the entire conversation. So I can't think of anything more practical than when you sit down with that person, how are you going to start this? Are you going to start by disagreeing, or start by saying, hey, listen, you go first. I want to hear your perspective. And then second step would be understand why they believe what they just said. And that's everything you just said about family background, culture, community, life experiences. The third step would be, after you've listened to all that, where do you agree with the person? And I force my students to do this. I don't care who they're listening to. Did you find any points of agreement? And if they say no, then that is what we describe as mind blindness. Mind blindness is you're wrong A to Z. And I'm like, I don't think anybody's ever wrong A to Z. So go back and find some common ground. And then the fourth step is, now what do you want to say? Based on all of that, what's the one or two things you might want to say? But you see how that kind of gets us in a nice trajectory? I
Mhm.
listen, I ask why you believe, I find common ground, now let me speak. And I
Oh,
think that's a great way to organize a conversation.
I love that. And Tim, I believe that, for some listeners out there, they may be sitting in that place where they think, I think that one of the reasons I do not engage in this hard conversations is because I really do not know how to. I'm
Right.
afraid. I'm afraid of stepping down from what I believe. I'm afraid of offending my God in my beliefs, and not defending Christianity as I should. Deep down inside, some people may have that kind of hard time, just being able to communicate correctly. So as we end this interview, which by the way, it was such a blessing. It was a
Oh, it's
really, really great conversation. I would love for you to share with the people who are listening right now, how do you believe that and the stalemate can help them in a practical way?
well, I think it gives us a game plan. My wife and I have been speaking at marriage conferences for almost 30 years. It's
Yeah.
insane how long
I thought you had been married for only like 10. You look so young.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm gonna play this everywhere. But I would never say to a couple, just jump into the finance conversation, or the
Mm,
sexual intimacy conversation, or the kids' schedule conversation. There ought to be just a little bit of a healthy fear that once you have that conversation, it can't be taken back.
mm.
Then have guardrails for the conversation, have a strategy. Right. And again, I would say listen first, find out why they believe, common ground sets a nice tone on the relational level. And again, I would say if the relational level is lacking, don't be so quick to get to content, work on the relational level and build that up, and then you can get to content.
I love that. Oh, Tim, what a great interview. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I will be sharing all this information with my audience. And guys, as most of our guests, he is giving away a copy of the book to someone in our audience. You just have to enter the contest, and we will announce on social media next week who the winner is. But go to my links on the show notes and get a copy of this book. I believe that it's a very timely book with our elections coming up. It's going to be a great read for anyone who wants to learn how to have open conversations regardless of people's beliefs. So
Well,
thank
thank
you
you.
so much, Tim. What a blessing.
Take care.
You too.